everybody. Raul here for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with bassist and educator Roy Vogt.
Hey, Raul, it's absolutely a joy to be here virtually and talk with you.
My pleasure, man. Well, there's so much that we've heard of you with your educational programs and performances and all, your teaching and the Nashville scene and all that stuff, but we always like to go back to the past to get an idea kind of where you came from. How did you get started in music and on bass?
Well, like everybody else of my generation, I was watching the Ed Sullivan Show, in 1964 in February, and I saw the Beatles, and I was like, I got to do that. However, I had a long and circuitous way around to get there because my dad was a wonderful man, but he didn't want his son to be a rock and roll musician at all. So that wasn't going to happen. So I think I ended up starting on my grandfather's mandolin, and I managed to catch getting them to go to Radio Shack and get a little contact mic so I could have, quote unquote, an electric mandolin and plugged it into the family stereo. And that, worked for a while. And then I ended up getting an acoustic guitar, which I still have, and it is just unplayable. It's an old K that I got, and it's in pieces. I'm actually trying to get my wife to do an art project of it and paint it, because it's interesting, and it's definitely part of my history. Once again, close but no cigar. But I started playing my first real instrument when I was 12, and it was a baritone horn, just like Chuck Rainey. Chuck and I both started on baritone horn. And my brother was a trumpet player, and I was like, well, I want to be in the band, but I don't want to play trumpet. You're already playing trumpet. So I learned baritone horn, which was, bass clef. And then two things kind of collided at once. One was we got a new band director, and he said, we're going to have a stage band, which was kind of their way of saying a big band, a jazz band. This is about 1970. And, I was kind of thinking, oh, this is great, man. I love playing jazz. I've heard enough of it. Sure. And he's like, well, unfortunately, there's no baritone horns in jazz band, but we do need a bass player. And so there was that. And then there were a bunch of my friends had guitars, and a couple of guys had drum kits, but nobody had a bass. There were guys that were kind of tuning down guitars to make it work however they could. And so the light bulb came on. I was like, well, let's see. Bass for big band, and then bass for all these rock bands that are starting up. This is about 1970. And so I went to my dad and said, hey, Dad, I need to get a bass so I can be in the junior high jazz band. He was like, oh, you mean like a tuba? I was like, no, a bass guitar. And he was like, well, if you earn the money to do it, I can't stop you. And so I went and got a summer job working for him. Fortunately, he had a business, and this was way back in 1970. You could get a Social Security card. You could pay taxes and work back then. And so I was his loading dock third, and I was also the sweep up and mop up guy. I was the janitor. So I'd go in the mornings, and I would sweep out the offices and the warehouse, and then whatever dirty, nasty jobs that the warehouse guys didn't want to do, the kid would do it. The boss's kid would do it. And so I was like, I would, be unloading and sorting soil pipe, which is just nasty. It's like cast iron pipe that's covered in tar. Oh. So you get done with it, and you get home, you take a shower, and you're gray from the waist up because of the tar. It was gnarly. But I get to the end of that summer, and it was probably beginning of August, and I'm talking to my mom. I said, I need to go ahead and get a bass guitar because a band's going to be starting up, and I'll need to get some lessons and learn how to do this for stage band. So I was doing my pitch, and so we went to Alt's Music in Fort Worth, Texas, and I had enough money to buy a little, I think it was probably like a K electric bass and some kind of a little Japanese amp. And God bless my mom, man, because she looked and she saw that and she said, that doesn't look really good. How much is that one over there? And it was a Gibson Kalamazoo EBO copy and a Gibson Thor amplifier. And, it was a bit more than I had, but she said, I'll tell you what, I'll match what you I'll match what you made over the summer and we'll get this. And we came home and had this Kalamazoo by Gibson EBO copy. And I wish I still had the amp. It was great because it was a tube amp with 2 tins and it was probably 40 watts. And you could drive it, man. It would sound like Jack Bruce. And Jack Bruce, the two guys that were like then touchstones were the Jacks. It was Jack Cassidy with Jefferson Airplane and Jack Bruce with Cream, man, and that was it. And then off to the side, there was Paul McCartney and Chris Hillman with the Byrds and Harvey Brooks with the Electric Flag and Super Sessions and all that stuff. That's what I wanted, man. I wanted to be Jack Bruce at that point, you know, like a lot of guys in 1970. So from there, got involved in high school band, got involved in rock bands, got into my first kind of semi-professional bands when I was a junior in high school, and was in the band that you rent the mini warehouse and you rehearse 2 or 3 nights a week. And at that point, I wasn't working full time as a musician. I was getting some gigs, but I was working as a landscaper for a couple of nursing homes. And so once again, I saved up all of my money, and I ended up going to Arnold and Morgan Music and getting an acoustic bass stack, an acoustic 136 with a 215 cabinet. Nobody told me about ohmage, so I would routinely blow the thing up because there was an ohmage mismatch. But then from there, you know, I think I got a Guild Bluesbird. I got my first Fender when I got my first really good electric bass teacher and upright bass teacher, a guy named Eddie Garcia, who had been the bass player in the 1971 1 O'Clock Lab Band at North Texas State. I knew I was going to probably go to North Texas State. By then, I'd read about Joe Osborne and Carol Kay and was kind of getting a feel for what being a studio musician was about. And I went to one of Carol's master classes in Dallas. So I was getting a feel for it. And Eddie was a guy who was like a local studio player. There were 2 or 3. There was a guy named Ernie Chapman, who was one, and then there's a guy who's still an active jazz educator, now a guy named Lou Fisher. And Lou was another guy in Dallas, and they were all the guys that were doing, you know, at that point, this is way pre-Pro Tools and MIDI and anything. And so there was a lot of work in Dallas doing radio station IDs and jingles. And so there was an industry, and those guys were making really good money doing that. And so I was like, that's for me. That's what I want to do. And all those guys a lot of them had gone to North Texas State, and they just stayed in town. And I thought, well, you know, they're going to North Texas State. I got to go to North Texas State.
Sure.
And I got involved in the jazz band program there. But before that, my senior year of high school, I found out through an audition. And I was auditioning for a theme park, and there was a little kid who looked like he was about 14, Gilbert Cruz, and I was like 17, and I kind of thought I was a cat because I'd done like the high school musical, and I'd played in these rock bands. I was making some money, and I ran into him at the audition for this theme park, and he just smoked me so bad, and I was like, I'm either going to have to find out who your teacher is, or I'm going to have to quit. And so I was like, who did you study with? He said, oh, this guy, Ed Garcia. And so I chased Ed down, and it took me I'm guessing about 3 to 4 months because he was really busy. And I finally caught some lessons with him. We finally started getting a workflow going, and I could read pretty well because I was focused on that. But we worked more on it. And then I went to North Texas, and when I got there, I realized they had no electric bass program whatsoever. You know, I got there and it was like, get an upright, get a bow, get a copy of Samandel. No, if you want to learn jazz bass, that's on you, man. We're going to learn classical. We're going to get to Son, kid.
Yeah.
You know, and that really wasn't what I wanted to do in 1974. I wanted to be a studio player, but I was hearing guys like Stanley Clarke, and I was a big fan of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I was a big fan of progressive rock bands like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and King Crimson. And I was like, no, man, electric bass, and I really want to. And by then I'd bought this Franken-Fender that I found in Dallas that was a 65 jazz neck on a 63 Peabody, and the builder had taken all the electronics out and put them in. So it was like if you plugged into one jack, it was a P bass. You plugged into the other jack, it was a jazz bass. I wish I still had that bass, but it got stolen off of an Air Florida flight in 1979. But it was a great bass. And I really wanted to work on the electric stuff. And I was at North Texas, and I was doing my best. I was working with, I was in the big bands, and I was doing society gigs in Dallas, and I was doing some studio work and all that. But I was really frustrated. And I talked with one of my teachers, a guy named Dan Hurley, who was a jazz, piano, and improv teacher. He's retired. He's like a professor emeritus now. But he said, I said, Dan, I'm just dying here. I'm hearing all this electric. And by then it's like 1976 and 77, and Jocko's come out, and I hear all of that. And that's, even more, I'm really into it. I'm really wanting to go that way and really wanting to play creative electric bass. And he said, well, maybe you should go to the University of Miami. And they had a great teacher there. This was after, they had Jocko for a very, very short time. Mm-hmm. And then after that, they had a couple of guys, including Frank Gravis, who was one of Jocko's students. But by then, they had a guy named Don Kaufman. And Don ended up retiring from there about 2 years ago. But I went down and I took some lessons with Don, and I kind of got a feel for how I felt about that school, and they got a feel for how they felt about me. And so they offered me a graduate assistantship to go down there and teach and go to grad school and get my master's. And I was like, yeah, this is it, man. I want to go here because this is what I'm hearing. Mm-hmm. And so I went down there in 1979. And I was there for a year and a half, got my master's, and December of 1980, I loaded up the U-Haul and drove to Nashville. And I knew one guy who was this guitar player that I'd played in a fusion band with back in Texas. And we'd done some good things. With a fusion band, we'd recorded a record that eventually came out like 30 years later. But we were the opening act for, we opened for the LA Express. We opened for Larry Coryell. We got to do a lot of touring with Larry and playing in Dallas and Austin. And he was doing solo stuff at that point. And we would do a set, and he would do his solo stuff. And at the end, we'd come back out and we'd play some of Larry's tunes. So for a 19, 20-year-old kid, we're like, man, here I am playing Larry Coryell in the 11th House tunes with Larry Coryell. It's like, yeah, this is it, man. This is what I want to do. So Skip had moved from Dallas, where he was at, to Nashville, and he was working with a gospel label and working with a gospel singer. And he was basically doing their copy work. This was a publishing company, so he was doing some of their publishing demos. And he was like, yeah, come to town. And the whole idea of him getting me to come to town was that he wanted to restart our fusion band up there, which was a band called Aurora. And it was, I guess he wanted to do Aurora 2.0 or Mark II or whatever, Mark III. Mm-hmm. And so I moved up there, and, I had an Alembic bass, which I still have, and I had an Ibanez fretless PJ, precision jazz, or it was actually just a fretless P bass. And by then I'd seen Mark Egan with the Pat Metheny group, and I was like, oh man, you got to put the jazz pickup near the bridge to get this tone. And so I went and took that bass and put a Bartolini in it. And so that was what I brought to Nashville. And of course, the very first thing that somebody said was, hey man, you're going to have a Fender for here. And by then, of course, the super Fender that I had that had gotten stolen off the Air Florida flight, I got the insurance money from that, got a 66 Precision that had been refinished. And to all of the young bass players out here watching, I'm sorry, because what I did next was what everybody did back then, and that's the only excuse I have. I had a 66 P bass. I had it routed out and put a jazz bass pickup near the bridge. Yeah. And I'm sorry. Whoever has that bass now, I'm sorry. Maybe you managed to fill in the wood, but it had already been refinished, so there was no collectability in it in the 66. And so that was my studio bass for a long time. I had that, and I had a music band, and that was what I used. And for a while there, I think my first real instrument company that I dealt with as an endorser was Ibanez. And I had a couple of the Ibanez musician series, which was once again kind of a PJ with the electronics to match. And then from there, it was just when you get to a place and you start doing studio work and you start paying attention, you look at what the other players are doing. And I kind of jokingly say I kind of got caught up in the arms race. I got I think the very next thing I got was a couple of modulus graphite basses. I got, because Michael Rhodes was playing a modulus graphite neck on a jazz bass, and I thought that's really a cool sound. Of course, most of it was Michael. I mean, the moduluses were great, but I ended up getting the very, very first six string that anybody in Nashville had that wasn't a Tic Tac bass. It was an '83 neck through modulus Quantum 6, and I went down to Atlanta and bought it there and brought it back and started using it on sessions, and people thought I was nuts because, you know, and I was, it was kind of like a stretch, because going from the Fender and even my Alembic and then bringing out this thing with an additional low and high string, I'd have engineers say, man, I'm not sure that the speakers are going to reproduce that low B, man. I'm like, well, wait a minute. I've been tuning, you know, by then I'd been playing, I was in Nashville by like 3 or 4 years, and I'd been doing sessions where I was tuning my E string down to a D and a C to get extra low notes. So I thought, well, you know, let's try it. Just try it. Trust me on this. Just try it. And so at a certain point, I then bought a neck through modulus. I had Jeff Gold make me one that had Olympic electronics in it, and it was a 5-string. And so the whole thing was, I loved Jimmy Johnson. By then I was really aware of him with Flem and the BBs and with his bass playing with Alan Holsworth. And I was like, I want that sound. I really want that sound. And I couldn't afford another Alembic, you know, by then. I was a successful working musician, but I wasn't a millionaire. Sure. And so I had them do that and then buy, I bought Olympic electronics, spoiler electronics, and I had them install them in. And it was my poor man's Jimmy Johnson bass for years and years and years. And then the funny thing about Nashville in the late 80s and the early 90s is that, and now we've kind of cycled back around to more conservative, but by then everybody I knew was, you know, if they had a Fender, they had EMGs in it, they had high mass bridges, and I'm like, we're not playing Fenders anymore. You know, we're really not. We're playing active electronics in these Fender shells, and we're adding whatever else we want. And a lot of guys were starting to get the modulus basses. A lot of guys were starting to get pedulas, particularly the fretlesses. And so it was a wide field at that point, and you could pretty much bring anything in. And I think to a certain extent you can still to this day. It's really more up to the player and up to the level of trust that the player has with the artist and more importantly, the producer, because the producer is going to be the one that goes, I like what he's doing. You know, let's call him again. The artist comes and goes, but the producer is the one and that you have to kind of make a relationship with. So basically over time, what I started doing was I started trying different brands and different basses. And about 1992, I was doing my first large marketed instructional videos for Beaver Felton for the old Super Chops for Bass company. And he was a Carvin guy. And I looked at the Carvin basses and I was looking at the catalogs and I was like, man, these are really pretty. By then I was starting to want a slightly wider spacing on my sixes, and they were starting to do sixes. And I was like, this could work. So Beaver kind of introduced me to the artist relations guy there way back in 1992. And by then I'd been a studio guy and a touring guy for a long time. I'd been in Nashville for 12 years, and I played with Dickie Betts for a year and a half, the guitar player from the Allman Brothers. And I played with one of the guys from the Dukes of Hazzard, John Schneider. I did a tour with him, and we were opening for Alabama. And this was probably 1987. At that point, Alabama was like, that was like opening for Garth Brooks, man. We were playing whatever hockey rink was there, and you know, we would do our opening set, and then we'd be back at the hotel or whatever. You know, it was wonderful. I was like, I love touring. But by then, I'd kind of been in 2 or 3 different country bands, and I'd been in a heavy metal band that was on Polygram, and that was a band called Joanna Dean, and it was basically like it was like if you had Maggie Bell or Janis Joplin singing in front of AC/DC. That was us, because we had a killer vocalist named Joanna Dean Jacobs. And so that it was Joanna Dean and the Big Noise, and we were out doing the metal things. There are videos that exist of me with like hyper long hair and black leather playing really, really hard rock with a great band. But, you know, by 92, I was working with Jerry Reid, and I'd been working with him for like, I think I started in 1989. So I'd been working with him 4 years and done some TV shows with Chet Atkins and Jerry, and done some TV shows with Jerry and some recording. And, you know, I still had my modulus basses. I had a Tobias 5 that I'd gotten in 1985. So I started using the Carbon stuff in 92, and I've just never left. I kind of went all the way through to when they changed their brands to their branding. I think in 2015, they split the company and they became Kiesel Guitars, because Kiesel is the family name. So, and I'd known Mark Kiesel from back in the 90s and the early 2000s when I was still playing their basses with Jerry. And then I did 7.5 years touring with a pop singer with Engelbert Humperdinck. So we went all over the world with that. And I was taking the Carbon basses and also Conklin basses. By then I was working with Conklin and playing one of the Groove Tools 7-strings, the Bill Dickens model, which was kind of cool. Bill's a good friend of mine. So it was a really cool thing to play that bass. At this point, I've been a Carbon artist, now Kiesel, since 1992. So that's coming up on 30 years that I've been playing their instruments. And within that, I've got 2 or 3 of their instruments that are very Fender-y looking. The joke I have about Nashville is you need to have 1 or 2 FSOs, which is a Fender-shaped object, which, you know, could be a Mike Lull, it could be a Sadowski, it could be a Fender, it could be a Mike Stevens, it could be one of these Kiesels. I have a 5-string jazz bass and a 4-string Precision with a jazz pickup. Old habits die hard.
Sure.
And then, you know, I've also got my signature 6s that they worked with me on about, at this point, 5 years ago. We worked on the design, and that's been out there. Gotcha. And that's kind of that's my studio workhorse now, if I know who you are, because it's a 6. You know, if somebody doesn't know you and you show up with a 6, they're like, well, oh, this is great. I've hired John Patitucci for my session, you know, and I was like, no. If I don't know you, I will bring the 4, and I'll bring a 5, and I'll bring a couple of 6s, and I'll probably play the 6s unless you ask me to play otherwise. And most of the time, the 6s, when I worked with them, I said, this needs to sound like a Precision if I needed to. This needs to sound like a modern bass if I needed to. So that's, you know, kind of, that was the jumping off point. That's, you know, and we can talk about that when we talk a little bit deeper about equipment. But along with all of these other things that had happened, one of the role models, you know, the guys that I really wanted to emulate were teachers, because my first mentor, Ed Garcia, was a guy who taught. He taught at a couple of community colleges in Dallas, and he taught at University of Texas at Arlington. And he was also a working player. You know, my first really good gigs were subbing for him because he got double booked. They were like touring with Jesse Lopez, with Trini Lopez's brother, and working these showrooms in the 70s, working for these contractors because Ed would get double booked, and he'd be like, well, I'll send the kid. Yeah. The kid can read, you know, the kid can do fine. So, you know, I saw that, and then Don and most of the faculty I knew at University of Miami, they were all busy players. They were doing studio work. When I first got there, the guy who ran the program was actually on a leave of absence because he was on a Bee Gees tour. So I was like, wow, yeah, I want to do this. I want to be a teacher, but I also want to be a player. Mm-hmm. So when I got to Nashville, it made sense. I kind of hung out my shingle as a private teacher. And in 1983, a friend of mine, Jim Ferguson, had been teaching at Belmont University, where I've been teaching since 1983, and he was moving over to teach commercial voice because he's a great singer. He's a great bass player, but he's also a great singer. And he was on the afterboard and, did a bunch of studio work as a background vocalist as well. So when he moved over to a full-time vocal position, they needed somebody, and I came in as an adjunct, just a part-time teacher, and I've just sort of never left. I was part-time for years and years and years. When I stopped touring in 2003, I said, I think I want to turn this into a full-time position. And it took me about 2 years of working with the administration. And so I've been a lecturer on string bass and electric bass since 2005, so 15 years. And it's been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed it. The kids are great.
And as an educator, not only are you involved with, again, private lessons and teaching at Belmont, but you also were kind of one of the early people to jump onto the video lesson concept.
Yes. Right. Yeah, with the Super Chops for bass. And then this thing, which is now, this is one of the old DVD sets from Teach Me Bass Guitar. Mm-hmm. And I think Damien Erskine did a really, really kind review years ago on that. Kudos. Just to show how small of a world that it is, Damien's father was a guy named John Worster, and John was one of my mentors. John was a great bass player who played with a Stan Kenton Orchestra. So I met John, I think in 1971. And then years later, he was hanging out in Denton, and he was just hanging. He was like working in Dallas. I think he was dating a friend of mine who's a piano player. And John was the guy that was like, hey man, come over to my house, let's just play. And I'd bring my upright, and he would work with me on, it wasn't lessons as much. It was just like, let's hang out and swap ideas. But yeah, that's Damien's dad. But anyway, I think that is still there. You can still get it on Teach Me Bass Guitar. Now, of course, there's no more DVDs. It's all downloadable and streaming, and just like the rest of the world,
It's evolving. Yes.
It's evolving. We're all evolving with that. Yeah.
Well, and it is fascinating because even as you mentioned, the bass is such a new instrument. And when you look at like the educational institutions, not including electric bass, but they've begrudgingly had to do so, where now you only could learn from as good of a teacher as you had in town. And if you lived in the boondocks, you're lucky. Like my first guitar teacher, I started on accordion actually, but when I did get to strings, that was because of the Beatles as well. My guitar teacher was also a milkman by day, and he just happened to teach guitar by night. And it was all there was rhythm guitar. It was chords, and kind of do this and do that, and it was as good as it got for my geographic location. But now, again, first with DVDs, and then now with the internet, you could be anywhere and learn from some of the greatest people and best educators available, whereas before you had to go to where they were and work your way into their program. So it's great to see that evolution.
It is, and that's one of the good things about now is that you can find almost anything online. Mm-hmm. As far as if I'm teaching a student and they need to know what Paul Chambers sounded like, not only can I go and find Paul Chambers on YouTube, but I can find a TV clip of him playing with Miles Davis playing So What? And I'm like, okay, so this is what he sounds like. And so if I'm talking about Jocko, there's innumerable clips, everything from his instructional VHS from years ago that ended up being used in a lot of the documentaries, but there's a lot of concert footage from him with either the Word of Mouth Band or Weather Report in Europe that we never saw. We didn't get to, it's interesting because every once in a while I'll get curious about a player and I'll go and I'll find like Europe is really good about giving jazz artists their due. So I can go and find decades worth of Stanley Clarke videos of just And it's not anything that's on a music show other than it might be a documentary. It might be Italian television for the Montreux Jazz Festival or the Umbria Jazz Festival or something like that. So, it's one of those things where we get spoiled now because there is this embarrassment of riches. In a way, it's kind of bad because with my students, they don't know where to turn, man. You can go down the rabbit hole for 15 or 20 hours straight watching different people and come up out of that and go, wow, that was amazing. I don't know what I saw, but that was amazing. And, the other thing is, of course, as one of my idols as a younger player, Frank Zappa, once said, if you function in a visual medium, then it's very easy to do things that look good rather than sound good.
Sure.
And so a lot of times with everything being on video as well, there's kind of a circus aspect to it that you get into where you have stuff out there and then you have to kind of pick through and you can kind of find the knowledge. But I'm one of those people that really thinks that you can find knowledge in a lot of different places. I'm not a purist. There's a lot to be said for being able to go and look at that Jocko video and go, oh, yeah, that's how he held his hands.
Yes.
Oh, this is where he played that. My experience was this. In 1977, I got a ticket to Weather Report and Al Di Meola's band at North Texas State. And I went and noticed that there weren't any ushers chasing you away. And I went and I got out of my seat and I went down and I sat on the floor 15 feet in front of Jocko and just looked up at him and was like, oh, yeah. And then I went home and I got my jazz bass out and I kind of twiddled the controls and I was like, there's the sound.
There it is.
That was it. But, I was lucky. I got to see him. A lot of people didn't. I didn't get to see Stanley physically play a bass until 1978, just because I missed the one time that he had played with Return to Forever that I could go to, which was at La Bastille in Houston, Texas, which was the jazz club there. And he never played Dallas. And I was in Dallas. He played Austin. But they finally played the Music Magic Tour, and I remember I subbed out my gig and I had it was a pretty good gig. It was I think it was like a $200 or $300 gig in 1978. And I was like, I don't care. I've got to go see him.
Yeah.
Because I've been hearing him for years. And I've got all these records, and I've copied his stuff, and I've transcribed his stuff, and I've written to him. I've written letters to him, sent him transcriptions. I've got to see what he does and how he plays. And so it was like one of those things where I don't need your money. I got to go see Stanley Clarke, So it was because that's what you had to do. And now, Of course, it's kind of like you can go and you can watch Richard Bona for 25 hours and not see the same thing twice. And unfortunately, the thing is, if it's all at your fingertips and you don't pay for it, you undervalue it.
Exactly.
And that's the downside. That's the downside. And that we have to, and, I'm going to sound like an old geezer, but I'm like, if you love what a musician does, support them. Yeah, I know you can watch them on YouTube. Yeah, I know you can listen to them on Spotify. Buy their records.
Sure.
Buy their downloads. Buy their books. Support the arts. They need your patronage at this point. And that's my PSA. That's my...
There you go.
I will now climb down off the soapbox.
Well, and I've so many times, and I know people that have seen many of my interviews will have heard me quote Victor Wooten, because we had a chance to chat when he was playing up here in Portland, Oregon. And he had made that exact same point, that back in the day, people used to pay for music. You'd buy records, you'd buy tapes, you'd buy, your 8-tracks and stuff, and television was free. Now, people will pay for television, but they expect to get all their music for free.
Right. And, Victor and I have been friends since 1988. I will not allow myself to be on his guest list. I will not. I'll say, I'm buying a ticket, Victor, and I'm coming to your show, or I'm buying your CDs. It's not that I couldn't get on the guest list and all that because we've been friends, but that's not the point. He's my friend. I want him to keep doing what he does.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to buy his records. I'm going to buy his books. I'm going to buy physical CDs so that it's like the most money going into his pocket possible. At this point, we've all, if you like bass, we've all got to be patrons of the arts.
Absolutely.
So I think hopefully someday soon we'll see the revenue stream kind of adjust itself and right itself, And I think at least now people are aware and they're talking about it.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's the biggest thing is especially when you add in the factor of a pandemic, which has had us have to reconsider many things, because a lot of the paying gigs like Broadway, like, concerts, all the tours, a lot of these things are all on hold. It's kind of giving people a moment to settle back and go, okay, how am I going to work the business side of this so I can continue to exist, because so many of the things that I could do have dried up.
Right. There's two really incredible opportunities for everybody right now. One of them is that chances are really good that anybody that you ever wanted to study with in a master class or even private lessons, you probably can, because everybody's sitting at home. And anybody that you ever wanted to play on your records, thanks to broadband and file sharing, you can get them to play. I mean, if somebody wants me to play on their records, all they got to do is find my website and email me, and we'll work out for you to send the files, and I'll go to my home studio and record your tracks. I've recorded tracks for people from as far away as the Ukraine, and back when they were still touring, I did tracks for a guy on the Ringling Brothers Bluecast Circus train.
Wow.
So, it's like the technology has so changed from when I first got to Nashville 40 years ago. You had to have a physical studio, and you had to have the means to hire the physical studio. You had to hire the players. You had to go in and get everybody's schedule coordinated and go in and record. And maybe if you were crazy rich, you could fly the tape over to Los Angeles and get a Robin Ford or a Larry Carlton or a Jimmy Johnson to record on your record. And then you'd physically carry the tape back, And on my first record, it's hysterical, but I remember on my first record, I had T. Lavitz play some keyboards on it. And the way that I did it was that I did a DA-88. No, it was an ADAT. I had the studio that I was recording my record at do a rough mix of the band tracks, and then I literally put that on 2 tracks of an 8-track ADAT, and I mailed it. I physically mailed it to T.
Oh, wow.
And in Southern California, and said, fill it up. This is what I want. Here's the charts. Here's the, and he mailed it back. And then, God rest his soul, a couple of years later, I was playing with Engelbert at the MGM Grand. And no, it was exactly at that time. And when he was done, he said, hey, I can mail it back, but I'm going to be in Las Vegas. I said, man, come on, I'll get you tickets to the show. And so he came. I think I was playing it was probably at the Las Vegas Hilton, which was the place Elvis did. And so he brought the tracks back for me, brought the ADAT back, and I carried it back to Nashville on the Southwest Airlines flight. It was in my carry-on up in the overhead. And then I took it back to the studio with the guy that was helping me with the first record and said, here's T. Lavitz's tracks. Let's put them on this. And now, of course, you just send the files, So it's a totally different world. I've done a fairly reasonable amount of session work during the pandemic, but I've done 2 live sessions, and everything else has been kind of lonely because they'll send me the tracks and I record and then they send it back. And, otherwise you get this. If I'm in a studio here, you get me here about, 10, 15 feet away from the other guys, and I'm like, hey, good to see you. No, I'm not going to shake hands. Maybe an elbow bump. And no, I'm not going to go hang in the control room, because these are the times we're in right now. But it's kind of like with a lot of stuff, I think, in a good way, it's gotten everybody to slow down and think and talk. And, it's like my friends at Berkeley, Steve Bailey and Victor Wooten and John Patitucci, they're doing these webinars every week. And my gosh, it's like last week, I think it was Steve Gadd and Anthony Jackson and Daryl Jones and all these people that you would never get out there because Steve would have been out with Eric Clapton.
Sure.
and Daryl would have been out with the Rolling Stones, but we're all sitting around. So, and interestingly enough, on Thursday nights, I'm in a group of educators that are called the Academic Bass Council. And it's, I'm sitting there with guys like Steve and Victor and John, but I'm also sitting there with guys like John Clayton and Ron Carter.
Wow.
And we're talking about managing teaching during the pandemic. And it's amazing. It is really amazing stuff. And we've all gotten really good at Skype lessons. We've all gotten really good at Zoom. Mm-hmm. We've all gotten really good at, one of the things I'm working with my students at Belmont with is learning multi-track recording, because it's like, this is your new reality for a while. Mm-hmm. And so at the end of last spring, instead of doing the normal playing juries, we were all on lockdown. And so I was like, here's your tracks. I want you to record your bass tracks on this. Here's the master without the bass. I want you to record your part. And so there was a lot of that. And that's good, I think. But even more importantly than all the technology, we're just all slowing down and talking to each other. And that's really important.
Gotcha.
I think communication is key.
Well, and as we're talking about recording, you have a new album coming up. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, that's cool. This is one of those things of serendipity. This was at the beginning of 2016, and there are a whole bunch of audio institutes here. A lot of the major studios like Blackbird and Dark Horse, and there's also the School of Audio Engineering, SAE. There was Art Institute. There are all these programs where they need guinea pigs. They need bands to record. Well, I had a student, and he was actually a retired software engineer, a guy named Pete Slicker. He's originally from the Netherlands, but I think as a boy he was from the Netherlands, and he'd grown up in Australia, and he'd made his mark as a software engineer in Australia, and he decided, I want to be an audio engineer when I grow up. So he's over there, and he's also a bass student of mine, and he's like, I need to record for my projects. And would you want to put together a band? I was like, yeah, I can get you a really incredible band. So I got the keyboard player I used on my last project, Tim McDonald. I got another keyboard player friend of mine to do one of the sessions, Eric Bakalis. Eric's the touring pianist and music director with Neil Sedaka, of all things. And then I got my friend Chester Thompson, who had played drums on my first record, on some of the tracks. And of course, people may know him from Weather Report and from Phil Collins and from touring with Genesis for years, and he's an artist in his own right. He did and of course playing with Frank Zappa. He's on a lot of really landmark Zappa recordings. So I got Chester on drums, and I got this kid, a younger guy named Justin Kalk, who's an incredible guitar player, and more of a rock guy who plays fusion, not a jazz guy who plays rock. And he reminds me so much of Tommy Bolin in the way that Tommy played on Billy Cobham's Stratus record, or Spectrum, and on Stratus. Just incredible, intelligent rock guitar. And so the only problem is I was having the worst case of writer's block, and I had nothing new. And normally I try to write everything. I was like, okay, I've got this incredible band. I've got the option of doing this record for this guy for his Blackbird Studios Recording Academy. Why don't I don't have anything else. Why don't we do some classic fusion covers? So we did 2 or 3 Stevie Wonder tunes. We did a couple of radical rethinks of a couple of tunes off of Blow by Blow. We did the tune Contusion off of Songs of the Key of Life, I think. We did a George Duke tune, Let Me At It. We did Valdez in the Country, which is a great tune by Bobby Womack that everybody from Cold Blood to Lee Ritenour and Donny Hathaway had recorded. And so we did, and a couple of classic, we did Tari and Matador off the Billy Cobham record. And so we did a Mingus tune. We did Boogie Stop Shuffle, but we did it kind of almost in the style of a Jeff Beck record. And so that ended up being this project. we couldn't get into Blackbird, but there was a great studio called Welcome to 1979 in Nashville that we recorded at, and it was vintage audio gear. I think it's an MCI 24 track or an MCI 24 track and a Studer console. So we were doing old school analog recording on 24 track 2-inch tape, just like we used to do in 1980 when I got here. And it was an adjustment because we're all sitting there recording. And I remember there was one take that we did, and Chester was like, man, if we could just move that snare hit. And he thought, oh, because you can't move anything. Yeah. It's not like Pro Tools. You can't snare the note. So what we got was what we got, which was incredible. And then, so most of the recordings are from that. There's another studio that I used called Tommy's Tracks because we couldn't get into Welcome to 1979 again. And Tommy's Tracks was a vintage, what they used to call a radar recording system, which is one of the very, very early digital recording systems. And once again, the whole thing of this was very vintage. So we were really, that particular record is called the 1979 Sessions, partially because a lot of the tunes were from the mid to late 70s. And the other thing is the studio that we initially recorded at was Welcome to 1979. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's a band called the 1979, and there's also Taylor Swift did a record called 1989. So I'm in there with numerical things. Anyway, we're finishing that up, and hopefully by the time that this interview is out on Bass Musician, you'll be able to go to my website, and in a very 2020 way, you'll be able to download all the tracks. Once again, don't just stream it. Go ahead and support the arts, because anything that we get is probably going to squander it on paying the musicians.
There you go. And that will be on royvogt.com, right?
That's correct. That'll be on royvogt.com, and of course, people can follow me on the usual suspects. They can follow me I'm a spare presence on Twitter. I'm a spare presence on Instagram. That's getting ready to change, but they can find me on YouTube. They can find me on Facebook, and I promise you, if you come to my Facebook page, it's just going to be music and bass. It's not going to be, there's not going to be a lot of fights. I don't like fights. I like sharing music. So
not a lot of kitty cats.
Well, I'm more of a dog person these days, but not a whole lot of dogs. Every once in a while you might see my personal trainer, who's I have a black and tan coonhound mix that he's my personal trainer because I get up in the morning and the very first thing he does is very loudly remind me that I'm supposed to take him for his walk. It's like, so he's my personal trainer. You might see Elvis, that's the hound, or you might see Baxter, who's my rat terrier mix, but that's about it. I'm not no kitty cat videos, a lot of bass, a lot of music.
Well, and since we're talking about sound, we should talk a little bit how you're getting your sound. And we kind of left off, you have a Kiesel signature bass now.
Right, and here's one right here. And basically, as you can see, first off, it's a 6-string. So, but the whole objective of it, it's a bolt-on, and it's got 2 precision pickups in it. So my whole objective with this is to get as close to a precision bass as I can with this. So to that end, I've got 2 precision pickups that are one of them is in the conventional position, the other one is slightly back toward the bridge, and it's not really a classic. If I go to the bridge pickup, it's not the classic PJ configuration. It's a little thinner than that, not much.
Okay.
If I get both of them up, it's almost like a modern 6, like maybe a Yamaha or something. It's got that. But the majority of the time, if I'm recording, I'm doing studio work for other people. And so the objective is to try to make them sound good. So what I found by trial and error is I had a modulus 6-string I was using, a later one, a 93, and it had all these quad coil Bartolini pickups in it. And so one of the things I found out was that my go-to sound was the dual precision pickups in it, because it was real. That's kind of the high mids, that kind of the grind mid-range that you get out of a P bass, because the P bass by itself can be a real, as far as being a solo bass sound, it's not a particularly pretty one. It's got a little bit more of a chest tone to it. But yeah, the P bass has a little bit more of kind of an upper mid emphasis. So, and that was the other thing, it's got a sweepable mid range, and the reason why is because I wanted to be able to kind of manicure the sound of the. I wanted to manicure the sound of the EQ to where if it needed to sound EQ-wise like a precision in a track, I could get that.
Gotcha.
So I didn't have to really change. Now, the thing is, psychologically, it does not look like a P bass. So you've got to really, like I said, if I go in for a recording session, I don't know you, I'll probably have my Carvin PJ 4-string and my 5-string jazz. And it's mostly there so that you don't get worried. So that it's like, no, I'm not going to play a bass concerto. I'm going to play the part that you need on your record. Now, if my solo efforts and my band efforts that with some of the jazz groups that I've recorded with, on those I'll stretch. But otherwise, I never lose sight as a recording bassist of what Joe Osborne said years ago. He said, we're a service occupation. It's not, when I'm working with somebody, it becomes very important what's their vision. I'm there to help them realize their vision. I have things that I try to bring. Everybody wants to put a little bit of their own personality in. You want to sign your work, but at the same time, you don't want to sign your work at the expense of the song. That's one of the first things you learn when you start recording for other people, is just exactly how little is required of you other than just good sense and good taste, that you're not going to go and try to bogart the entire song, unless it's a bass feature. If it's a bass feature, great.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful thing.
Following your sound chain, what kind of strings do you have on your bass? Right
now, I've got a set of what used to be called Special K, now they're Kaliums.
Okay.
And that's a guy named Skip Fantry. Mm-hmm. And he is I think he's up in your neck of the woods. And the one thing I like about those is that they're balanced. So they really feel consistent throughout the neck. So they're really easy. You can get them like a lot of small string builders. You can get them from just ridiculously slinky to these have a little bit of a pushback because I want them to be good recording strings. So I want a little bit more mass on these. But at the same time, it's one of those things that you start realizing with strings and with action in general. There's kind of this thing of the law of diminishing returns. You can have a really, really light action and a really, really light setup, and unless you're really careful with your touch, it's going to cost you a little bit. You're going to lose a little bit of sustain. You're going to lose a little bit of body. One of the few guys I know that can really make an ultra light setup work in any situation is Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy's setup is very light, and he's got a very light touch, but he really knows his bass. I guess he's been playing the same Olympics since probably the 1976. So yeah, he knows his instrument. There's a lot to be said for that.
Gotcha.
As far as cables, I use Guardian Pro Audio. A friend of mine, Jimmy Phillips, does those. They're really good. They're just very consistent. They're very clean. Mm-hmm. I've used everything from, at one point I was using Monster cables, and I even have somewhere back in my bag, I've got a $160 Terra Labs cable from the 90s. And it does sound very, very nice. And it is, but these are working great. They're not terribly expensive. They sound good. I'm not one of those people who says you can get by with the cheapest of the cheap, but within recording electric bass, that sounds fine. and it gets the frequencies out, and it's a good compromise between a live and studio cable. Since it's not a $160 cable, if something awful happens to it, it's not going to break my heart. And then the rest of the signal chain is I use DNA 1350 top, which is and it's a Class D, so it's very light. And then I use a couple of the DNA single 12 neodymium cabs. So once again, those are I think they're 26 pounds each. And, being somebody who grew up in the 70s, and, I can remember at one point I had a Sun Coliseum folded horn 18, and it was like moving a refrigerator. It wasn't as bad as a 360, but it was pretty close. Dave Nordskow, who's the guy behind DNA, Dave, I've known him since I was an early Eden endorser. And I think I was an Eden artist from 1996 on. And so I stayed with Eden until he brought out DNA, and then I just went with that because I like what David does. Because David, the one thing about his amps is they don't sound like a specific color. A lot of times with amplifiers, if you plug it into this amp, you're like, oh yeah, well that sounds like a hard key.
Yeah.
And I love hard keys, but they definitely have a sound. Mm-hmm. And then ditto, an Ashdown. An Ashdown kind of sounds like it has a certain sound. An Ampeg has a certain sound. Those are all great sounds. For me personally, it's good to have an amp that colors the sound as little as possible so that I can do my work. If I can get a little bit of color and just shape it as it needs to be shaped, then I'm a happy camper. And then about a year and a half ago, I started using a Nightwalker bass pre, and I met the guy behind the Nightwalker pre's way back at a Bass Player Live, I think in 2010. And I was interested back then. He had a vintage bass into a vintage cabinet. This whole thing was just, I want to plug into the vintage vibe. And this was just a preamp that you used in front of a power amp or a bass amp. And so I kind of got after him and said, you really should put an XLR out on it so that guys like me that do a lot of studio work can just take the tone of this preamp and plug the XLR in, and that becomes a front-end signal chain. So I basically, depending on what it is that I'm recording, I'll either use the Nightwalker or I'll use the front end of the DNA, and I'll just use the EQ section and the compression section and all of that there. With Nashville, when I started, it was just, you plugged your bass into a DI and they did all the work. And what happened over time was, especially in the 90s, there was this expectation that especially in some of the smaller project studios, that you would bring your own preamps in and you would give them the sound you wanted. And, that was an adjustment. So all of a sudden, that became part of the arms race, just like basses. I went through like 2 or 3 different eras of studio preamps. And I think when I started working with Eden at one point in the early 2000s, I got an Eden Navigator, and I was like, oh, this is great. Yeah. This has got so much flexibility in the tube amp or the tube preamp. And I'm like, yeah, I'm done. We're done here. That's what I tend to use now, is that. And like I said, when I was a kid, it was at one point I'd go to all the big concerts and I'd see rows of SVTs and rows of acoustic 360s. And I remember when I was about 15 or 16, I was like, man, how tall is the amp? I got to have a tall amp. And now I'm like several decades on the other side of that. I'm like, how light is it? Sure. I got to have a light amp. It's got to sound good, but at the same time, I don't want to have to hire a roadie or go to the weight room to move it around. And the DNA stuff's great for that. And the other big truism and the way that the business has changed is at a certain point, you get to the point where when you're playing a big venue, the amp is just your personal monitor because you're on in-ears. Mm-hmm. And that was the thing I got into with Engelbert. For years, I didn't take an amp. I had a signal chain and I had in-ear monitors, and that was it, and so anything that, I think our guitar player had an amp, and it was in a road case off stage. So everything was mic'd up, and there was nothing other than front of house coming out. And everything that you heard was either in the front monitors or in your in-ears. And so we've come to the point where it's not where we were in 1974 2004 when I went to see Deep Purple, and Glenn Hughes had 6 Cerwin Vega folded horn 18s on the stage, you know.
Oh, wow.
And I frankly don't know how many were plugged in because it was show business. You looked and you went, wow, he's got 4 high watt, 200 watt heads, and he's got all these folded horns. My gosh, that was what it was. You know, that's what it was back then. And of course, the front of house guys were probably going, you'd go up to them and they'd go, wow, that's really loud. They're probably, yeah, it's really loud. Try to mix that sometime, would you, buddy?
Absolutely.
You know? And so it's gotten, we're in a different era. We're totally in a different era.
Well, and moving away from gear, we should talk just a little bit about what's coming up. We're in the middle of the pandemic, so a lot of the normal things have changed, and you've touched base on your studio work and all that. We know you've got the 1979 sessions coming up. Any other plans or future projects?
Well, I've got a lot of archival stuff that I'm starting to release on my Bandcamp page, and it's all sorts of stuff. I did some great things with a virtuoso guitar player named Stan Lassiter in the Nashville area. We've got an old concert we did opening for the Eric Johnson Band in 1990, and that's getting ready to come out, and that'll be out about the same time as this interview. Otherwise, I'm doing an awful lot of Skype teaching. I'm still on full-time faculty at Belmont University, so my university teaching, which in this day and time is hybrid, I don't know if you can see, but back there behind me is a drum shield. So I've got actual physical students I'm teaching this week. We're doing alternating weeks, and you know, when a student comes in for their lessons, they're on the other side of this. This comes on. Mm-hmm. Once I'm done, they get one of these things to wipe down the area, and we all sanitize our hands. So we're making it work. Yeah. It's interesting. A lot of my colleagues are totally doing online instruction. We're doing a hybrid so far, and hopefully by the time this interview comes out, we'll still be on the hybrid because the disease has its own agenda. I can have all the intentions in the world, but that doesn't matter.
Exactly.
So in the future, I'm sure I'm going to be working on some more educational material. I've got 2 or 3 books that are knocking around back there I'll be putting together over the next year. I'll continue to teach. I've also got a band that I recorded with 2 years ago with a percussionist and a guitar player. Denny Chiosa is the guitar player. The percussionist is Tom Moeller. And so we have this band called the JVM Collective, and we've recorded a record, and right now we're label shopping. I didn't know you could still label shop in 2020, but here we are, label shopping. And I don't think that's going to be out yet, but that'll be out sometime in the coming year. And hopefully at some point we'll be in a position to do shows again. In the meantime, just the one thing I would say to anybody who's a music fan and who's a bass fan and likes to go to shows, I'd say just be a responsible person right now. Let's get this thing whipped, and let's get this thing in the rear view of history, in the rear view mirror of history, so that we can all go back out to enjoying concerts and enjoying seeing bands and clubs. And in the meantime, if you've got a favorite musician, support them. Go to their websites, buy their products. If you happen to need a really good 6-string bass,
get a signature.
Go to the Kiesel Guitar. Go to the Kiesel Guitar site and get one built. They'll thank you, and I'll thank you. So there's all these things that you can do to help the creative people in your sphere. We need you guys. We need you guys to play. We need you guys to keep the ball rolling and keep creating. But we also need you to support the rest of us. It's a brotherhood and a sisterhood. We've all got to hold each other up right now.
Absolutely. Well, Roy, I'm just so grateful to have a chance to hear your journey and about your gear and your music and your educational efforts. Folks, make sure you check out royvogt.com, staying on top of the upcoming album and future projects. And as Roy was saying, support your music, whether it's doing what you can by getting your instruments, your albums, your merch. And in addition to that, I would encourage people to, hopefully, as things come back more to normal, continue to support the efforts of public education and music, because it is an area that gets cut way too often. And in almost every conversation I have, you'll have somebody like Roy that if it hadn't have been for a middle school, high school jazz band, you might not be here today. And so...
Yes. Well, and see, for nearly 10 years, and unfortunately the pandemic shut down the 10th anniversary, I've done the Thunder Road Bass Invitational at Summer NAMM, and that was a fundraiser for the W.O. Smith Community Music School, which is for kids who don't have the means to afford music lessons to study with some of the best teachers in Nashville. And it's an incredible program, and exactly that. And we do need the arts, even if you're never going to be a painter or a musician or acting. We need the arts because they make us more human. That's a basic part of our humanity. And you can't shortchange that, or you'll pay for it later. So I'm quite with you, and I'm a product of public music education. I support public music education and will continue to do so.
Absolutely. Well, Roy, thank you again, folks. You've seen him here. Roy Vogt coming to you live on Bass Musician Magazine.
And really great to talk to everybody, and we'll see you soon.